The year is 1944. The war has become a clash of not only men, but machines, tanks, artillery, bombers, and the cutting-edge technology each side has been feverishly perfecting. Yet in the midst of this technological race, a quiet but profound shift is taking place on the battlefield. The Germans, with their powerful panzer divisions and finely tuned military machine, are stunned by an unseen force, the American adaptability. Time and again, they are faced with a strategy they cannot understand, a strategy that makes the Allies feel as though they are always one step ahead. The shock is evident in the German high command. They cannot comprehend why their tactics, once so devastating, seem to falter at every turn. Their reliance on rigid, time-tested plans now appears less effective against an opponent who moves unpredictably, striking with speed and innovation. The Germans are used to control, to a war fought with precision, but the Americans are different. They fight not with the predictability of discipline, but with the freedom of improvisation, a weapon the Germans, steeped in tradition, fail to grasp. In the face of this, the Americans embrace flexibility, thinking on their feet, adapting mid-battle. Whether it's through the use of deception, rapid repositioning, or unexpected attacks, their tactics create chaos in the German ranks. The machines are important, but it's the men, each thinking, reacting, and improvising, that make the difference. The Germans, with all their superior training and technology, cannot replicate this dynamic. And yet the real irony lies in the fact that the Germans, who are so obsessed with superior technology and experience, fail to recognize what truly sets the Americans apart. The Allies' success is not rooted in more advanced equipment or numbers. No, it's their ability to adapt and innovate in the heat of battle. As the Americans storm the beaches of Normandy, securing victory against all odds, the Germans are left to wonder, what is the secret to their success? The answer lies in a deceptively simple tactic, one that the German high command will overlook entirely. It is not the machines, not the tanks or planes, but the people who operate them and their willingness to break from tradition. What they fail to understand is that the future of war is not in the machines, but in the human mind. In the early days of 1942, the U.S. military found itself on the precipice of a new kind of warfare, one that would clash head-on with the rigid methodologies of the German high command. The American strategy, while appearing unorthodox, was rooted in a profound understanding of human dynamics and battlefield realities. It was a strategy based on flexibility, decentralization, and exploiting weaknesses rather than adhering to set patterns. As the war unfolded, the U.S. approach would rely on local commanders making decisions on the fly, shifting tactics in response to the ever-changing conditions of the battlefield. This autonomy, they believed, would become their strength. In contrast, the Germans, confident in their superior precision, discipline, and technological advantage, dismissed the American strategy as chaotic and ineffective. Their belief in the superiority of their advanced technology, their tanks, and their air power led them to underestimate the unpredictable nature of their opponents. In the eyes of German command, the Americans were disorganized, stumbling through battle without the clear guidance of their own high command. The Germans felt assured. The American approach, so at odds with their own methodical precision, would falter under pressure. But what the Germans failed to grasp was that what they viewed as disorderly was, in fact, the key to overcoming their own limitations. The Germans had built their strategy around predictability and control, tight formations, rigid command structures, and well-established protocols. But this very predictability became their weakness when faced with an opponent willing to abandon convention and embrace fluidity. The American forces, rather than directly confronting the German juggernaut head-on, began to focus on exploiting the gaps, focusing on the weaknesses in German defenses where their command structure had no quick response. It was this innovative, decentralized approach that turned the tide. By emphasizing adaptability and the ability to respond swiftly to shifting circumstances, the U.S. forces were able to keep the Germans on the back foot. What the Germans had failed to see was that adaptability, the very thing they dismissed, would become their undoing. In the months that followed, as battles raged across North Africa and the Pacific, the U.S. would demonstrate the power of flexibility in ways the Germans could not have predicted. But the full impact of this new strategy was still to unfold. What the Germans didn't yet know was that the tides of war were about to shift in a way they could not prevent. By 1943, the landscape of war had shifted. What was once a battle of brute force and rigid strategies was beginning to evolve. As the Allies tightened their coordination, something unexpected began to happen. The U.S. forces, often dismissed as unpredictable, began to make startling advances. German defenses, built on elaborate fortifications and the assumption of control, struggled to adapt to the speed and fluidity of the American approach. The Germans, for all their technological superiority and experience, found themselves increasingly baffled by the agility of their opponents. While the Germans remained rooted in a traditional method of warfare, carefully planned, predictable maneuvers, the Americans embraced the chaotic reality of war. The U.S. military thrived in the ever-changing conditions of battle, able to shift tactics on the fly. Where the Germans placed their faith in defense lines and predefined strategies, the Americans understood that the true key to success lay in the ability to respond swiftly and decisively to changing circumstances. They did not need to predict the enemy's next move. They could create the conditions for the enemy to misstep. To the German high command, this behavior appeared as disorder, a random, unorganized force charging forward without any coherent plan. They were wrong. The Americans' tactics were anything but random. What appeared to be disarray was, in fact, a well-thought-out use of unpredictability. The U.S. forces were using feints, deception, and surprise attacks, practices that the Germans had long dismissed as too crude for serious warfare. The Germans could not fathom that such tactics could be anything more than a minor distraction. But to the Americans, they were key to keeping the enemy off balance and forcing them into reactive positions. The culmination of this approach came at the Battle of the Bulge, where the Germans were caught completely off guard. Their highly anticipated counteroffensive faltered as U.S. tactics confounded their expectations. What they had assumed was disorder was, in fact, a deliberate and calculated strategy. The Germans, with all their precision and fortifications, failed to anticipate the power of deception and flexibility in combat. They had underestimated what the Allies had mastered, the ability to act swiftly, adapt, and above all, deceive. The German high command had been blind to the true strength of their opponents. In the coming months, this crucial error would begin to tilt the scales of war. And yet, even then, the full impact of this shift would not be fully realized until the very end. By the fall of 1944, the German high command believed they had mastered the art of defense. Their advanced fortifications, like the infamous Atlantic Wall, stretched along the coasts of Western Europe, fortified by entrenched positions and bolstered by superior firepower. The Germans were confident that their strategic depth would hold the Allies at bay. They believed their traditional methods, meticulous planning, decisive firepower, and well-coordinated counterattacks, were sufficient to repel any force. After all, these tactics had worked for years. The Allies, they assumed, would falter before the might of their defenses. But the Allies were about to rewrite the script. With each new offensive, the U.S. forces demonstrated something the Germans hadn't anticipated: speed, adaptability, and sheer unpredictability. American forces refused to conform to the expected patterns of battle. Their attacks were not bound by rigid plans or predictable movements, but by the instinct to exploit weaknesses wherever they appeared. This new kind of warfare challenged the German belief that their elaborate fortifications and structured tactics could guarantee victory. For every defense the Germans had meticulously constructed, the Americans found a way around it, a flaw to exploit. The Germans, unable to react with the same agility, were increasingly on the defensive. At first, the German high command dismissed these early signs as isolated incidents. The Americans, they reasoned, would eventually tire of their unorthodox tactics. The Germans held firm to the belief that conventional warfare, fortresses, firepower, and precision, would inevitably prevail. They could not fathom that the Allied success was not a fluke or a passing phase. Rather, it was the result of an entirely new way of thinking. The irony lay in the fact that the Germans had constructed a battlefield model that demanded the enemy play by their rules, a script they knew all too well. But the Americans were not following that script. They were writing a new one. With every operation, whether it was in the hedgerows of Normandy or the streets of Aachen, the Americans proved that warfare could be something entirely different. The Germans had assumed that predictable movements and rigid control were the key to victory. But the Allies had embraced chaos, fluidity, and improvisation. It wasn't long before the tourney. Point came. The success of the U.S. forces in smaller-scale engagements began to suggest that their tactical flexibility was not just a temporary advantage. It was reshaping the very nature of warfare. What the Germans had initially regarded as disorder and confusion now became a sign of strategic brilliance, the ability to improvise, to adapt in real time, and to create opportunities in places where they had not even thought to look. By late 1944, the revelation was undeniable. What the Germans had dismissed as chaos was, in fact, a calculated and lethal form of warfare, one that would soon leave their once impenetrable defenses in ruins. But what the German High Command still could not see was that the true battle was not for territory or fortifications. It was for the future of war itself. By 1944, the German High Command had come to a clear conclusion. Victory lay in overwhelming force. Their strategy was rooted in massed attacks, powerful defenses, and the belief that sheer strength, both in numbers and firepower, would be enough to break the enemy. The Germans had built their war machine around precision and power, believing that crushing assaults and impenetrable defensive lines would force their opponents to surrender or be obliterated. For them, this was the only way to win. It was an approach that had worked before, and they had little reason to doubt it would work again. But as the Allies pressed their assault across Western Europe, they quickly demonstrated a different approach. American forces, though often outnumbered and under-equipped, relied on speed, surprise, and the constant shifting of their tactics. They struck where the Germans least expected, exploiting weaknesses in their lines with the agility of a force unbound by tradition. The Germans, for all their might, found themselves struggling to respond, unable to adjust to the fluid and unpredictable nature of the American advance. The U.S. forces did not conform to the script the Germans had written for war. Where the Germans relied on massive attacks at fixed points, the Americans moved swiftly, evading the enemy's grasp and shifting the point of attack before the Germans could adapt. The irony of this situation was unmistakable. The very rigidity of the German command structure, with its strict hierarchy and carefully orchestrated plans, hindered their ability to respond effectively to the American tactics. The Germans had become prisoners of their own strategies. They were used to controlling the battlefield, to knowing where and when the enemy would strike. But the Americans, guided by a more flexible and decentralized command structure, were able to keep the Germans off balance. They were constantly changing their point of attack, forcing the Germans into reactive positions, unable to dictate the flow of battle. A crucial turning point came during the Battle of Saint-Lô, a pivotal moment in the Normandy campaign. The breakthrough at Saint-Lô was not the result of superior firepower or overwhelming force. It was the product of American ingenuity. Through skillful maneuvering, the Allies broke through the German lines, revealing that victory could be achieved not through brute strength, but through intelligence, flexibility, and a willingness to adapt. This victory marked a fundamental shift in the understanding of warfare. The Germans, who had placed so much faith in their formidable firepower, now faced an enemy that was outsmarting them at every turn. The revelation was clear. The key to defeating the Germans was not overwhelming them with superior strength, but outmaneuvering them with flexibility and adaptability. The U.S. Army had found the secret to overcoming the German war machine. It was not about brute force. It was about using one's mind, adapting to every challenge, and striking when the enemy was least prepared. The Germans, in their arrogance, had underestimated the power of adaptability, and it was this oversight that would ultimately bring them to their downfall. But as the Allies advanced, a new challenge loomed on the horizon. Would their flexibility be enough to overcome the looming threat of a last-ditch German effort to regain the initiative? The answer, still unknown, would soon unfold in the battles to come. By the close of 1944, the German High Command found itself increasingly perplexed. What had once seemed like a predictable conflict, with clear front lines and orderly engagements, was rapidly evolving into something unrecognizable. The Allies, particularly the Americans, had adopted a new kind of warfare, one that defied all the rigid rules the Germans had built their strategy around. What had once been a clash of force and discipline now seemed to be a game of shadows and deception. The Germans believed they were facing a traditional enemy, one they could defeat with their tried-and-tested methods: powerful tanks, massive artillery, and precise strikes. Yet time and again, they found themselves blindsided by the speed and unpredictability of American tactics. The Allies, particularly in the months following D-Day, had become experts at exploiting gaps in German defenses. Rather than confronting the enemy head-on, the Americans moved with uncanny agility, striking where the Germans least expected. It was as if the very nature of warfare itself had shifted. The Americans did not conform to the rules of engagement that the Germans had relied on for so long. Instead, they adapted to the terrain, the situation, and the weaknesses in the German lines, constantly moving, constantly shifting. Each new American attack was a step further away from the type of warfare the Germans had grown accustomed to. The result was a battlefield where the Germans were perpetually forced to adapt to the Americans, rather than the other way around. The irony was that the Germans simply could not comprehend the new American approach. They had long believed that warfare was a disciplined art, governed by strategy and predictability. The idea that war could be won through adaptability, through constant change, was foreign to them. Their military system was built on precision, on coordination, and on a clear hierarchy of command. In this world, there was little room for improvisation or rapid shifts in strategy. To the German commanders, the fluid tactics of the Allies seemed unprofessional, even reckless. They believed that the Americans would eventually exhaust themselves, that their unconventional methods would lead to failure. But that was not what happened. The turning point came during the brutal Ardennes offensive, where the Germans launched a massive counterattack, hoping to regain control of the front. But the Americans, rather than facing this threat with brute force, again used their agility and unpredictability to outmaneuver the Germans. They shifted rapidly, making it difficult for the Germans to anticipate their moves. Despite being outnumbered, the Allies held firm. The success of this unconventional tactic was a stark reminder. Strength alone was not enough to win this war. Flexibility, adaptability, and a willingness to break from tradition were now the keys to victory. The German High Command had missed the critical lesson of the war. While they focused on discipline and predictability, the Allies had mastered the art of adaptation. In war, it was no longer enough to be strong. One had to be capable of change, to think on one's feet, to react swiftly to an ever-shifting battlefield. This was a lesson the Germans could not learn in time, and it would cost them dearly. The end was drawing near, and the tide of war was shifting irrevocably. But could they still adjust before it was too late? By the summer of 1944, the Allies were advancing deeper into German-held territory, but the battlefield was becoming far more complex than anyone had imagined. While German forces relied heavily on their formidable defenses, imposing fortifications, entrenched artillery positions, and massed infantry, the Americans found an unconventional advantage: deception. With every step forward, the U.S. forces were not only engaging in direct combat, but also in a battle of misdirection, creating confusion and uncertainty in the German ranks. What the Germans saw as feints, half-hearted attacks, were in reality the opening moves in much larger, unexpected engagements. The art of deception became central to the American strategy, a tool that the Germans struggled to understand. From false radio transmissions to mock invasions, the U.S. military mastered the subtle art of misleading their opponents. The goal was simple yet brilliant: misdirect the enemy into believing the main Allied assault would come from one location, only to strike at another. At times, it seemed as if the Americans were playing a game of smoke and mirrors, but the impact was devastating. The Germans, already stretched thin across multiple fronts, found themselves overwhelmed, unable to predict where the real attack would come. Every false move made by the Allies shifted German resources, stretched their lines even thinner, and left them vulnerable. The irony of the situation was palpable. What the Germans believed were mere distractions or diversionary tactics were, in fact, the precursor to full-scale operations. The feints, which they initially dismissed as unimportant, often led to real engagements, leaving the Germans unprepared and scattered. This dynamic created a situation where the Germans were forced into a constant state of reaction, reacting not just to the real threats, but also to the feints that were leading them further into confusion. The more the Allies used this tactic, the more effective it became, and the more it eroded German confidence. The turning point came with the success of the D-Day landings in Normandy. The elaborate deception surrounding the landings, most notably the creation of a phantom army in the south of England, left the Germans utterly surprised. They were convinced that the Allies would land at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between England and France, and had fortified the area accordingly. But the real invasion came at Normandy, catching the Germans completely off guard. This misdirection was not only a brilliant military maneuver, but a signal of how warfare was changing. No longer just about firepower, but about how well one could control the battlefield through misinformation. The Allies had created a new type of warfare, one that exploited not just the enemy's weaknesses, but their perceptions. The success of these deceptive operations caused a profound shift in the war. The Germans found themselves caught in a never-ending cycle of responding to Allied misdirection, unable to identify the true threat until it was too late. The result was a series of victories, often with minimal casualties, that allowed the Allies to gain crucial ground. While the Germans had focused on defending physical terrain, the Allies had shifted their focus to controlling the psychological battlefield. The Germans were no longer just fighting soldiers. They were fighting an invisible army, one that could strike without warning and vanish just as quickly. And yet, despite the overwhelming success of these tactics, they were often met with skepticism and disdain. Deception had long been considered an unrefined tactic, even dishonorable in the eyes of some. But in the brutal theater of war, where the stakes were nothing short of life and death, the Allied forces understood that the ability to mislead and outwit the enemy could be just as valuable as brute force. What had been dismissed as underhanded soon became one of the most effective tools in their arsenal. The Allies had found a way to fight a war without ever firing a shot, and it was working. As the Allies pressed deeper into Germany, the Germans were left to wonder. How much longer could they keep up with the ever-changing strategies of an enemy they could no longer predict? What they didn't realize was that the very tactic they once mocked was about to deal them one of their most crushing blows. The war, it seemed, had just become a far more elusive and unpredictable enemy. By mid-1944, the Allied forces had learned a critical lesson on the battlefield, one that would change the course of the war. As the U.S. military pressed forward, fighting their way across Italy and into France, it became increasingly clear that speed and adaptability were just as vital as firepower and numbers. While the Germans remained fixated on their traditional, slow-moving tactics, attacks that adhered to strict lines and well-planned operations, the Americans demonstrated the power of flexibility. Instead of relying on predictability, the U.S. military adapted their approach based on battlefield conditions, adjusting to new threats and seizing emerging opportunities with remarkable speed. Every change in terrain, every shift in the German lines, was met with an immediate, calculated response. The Allies didn't wait for the enemy to make a move. They dictated the pace of the conflict. The contrast was striking. The Germans, accustomed to slow, deliberate operations, found themselves increasingly outpaced. Their plans, formed months in advance, began to crumble under the weight of Allied unpredictability. While the Germans relied on fortified positions and rigid formations, the Americans used the very terrain they fought on as an advantage. The U.S. forces understood that every battle wasn't just about winning. It was about seizing the initiative, controlling the rhythm of the fight, and adapting to whatever the enemy might throw at them. This ability to respond to a rapidly changing battlefield with intelligence and speed became their greatest strength. The Germans, for all their technological superiority and precision, could not keep up with the fluid nature of the American tactics. The irony of the situation was that what the Germans saw as chaos, as disorganized movement, was, in reality, a brilliant display of battlefield intelligence. To the Germans, the American approach must have seemed unpredictable, even reckless. But what they failed to recognize was that every seemingly chaotic action was backed by a tactical understanding of the enemy's weaknesses. The U.S. military was not simply reacting to events. They were thinking ahead, anticipating the next move, and adapting faster than their German counterparts could respond. This kind of flexibility was an innovation in itself, a strategic leap forward. While the Germans continued to rely on their established doctrine, the Allies proved that the key to victory wasn't in overwhelming force, but in outthinking the enemy at every turn. The turning point came with the success of American operations in Italy and France. Battles like the breakout from Normandy and the push through the Italian peninsula showcased that the U.S. forces were not simply relying on brute force to win. They were using their minds. In Italy, American forces faced a stubborn German defense, yet their ability to change tactics on the fly allowed them to make rapid breakthroughs. In France, the swift exploitation of gaps in German defenses during the Normandy landings had already set the stage for success. The Allies, instead of following the rigid strategies of their opponents, were free to adapt and innovate. The result was victories achieved not by sheer strength, but by speed, intelligence, and adaptability, qualities the Germans had underestimated. For the German High Command, the inability to adapt was becoming apparent. Their insistence on sticking to traditional tactics in a rapidly changing world was their undoing. While the U.S. forces learned to think and act faster, the Germans found themselves trapped by their own adherence to outdated methods. Each day spent clinging to their rigid tactics made it harder to react to the evolving nature of warfare. The Germans were losing the ability to shift and respond quickly to the American advances. The realization had not yet fully dawned on them. The nature of war had changed, and the key to winning was no longer simply overwhelming the enemy with force. It was outthinking them, moving faster and adapting on the fly. The result was clear. The U.S. military, through its ability to think and adapt faster than its enemy, began to dominate the battlefield. The speed of thought had become a new weapon, one that allowed the Allies to shape the war in ways the Germans could no longer anticipate. But as the Allies pressed forward, they would soon face a new challenge. The Germans, desperate and cornered, would have to find a way to break free of their own limitations. But could they? Or had their failure to adapt sealed their fate? By late 1944, the war was in full momentum, and the Allies were beginning to unravel the German war machine piece by piece. Despite the Germans' advantage in firepower, advanced technology, and fortified positions, they were being outflanked time and again by a force that was more agile and capable of adapting to the ever-changing battlefield. The Americans, whose strategy had evolved throughout the war, understood that it was not sheer force that would win the war, but the ability to recognize and exploit moments of weakness. While the Germans held on to their belief that overwhelming firepower and defense would suffice, the Americans knew better. Victory lay in identifying and striking at the gaps in the German defenses. For the Germans, the strategy of holding firm in strong, static positions had long been their cornerstone. Their elaborate defenses, from the formidable Atlantic Wall to the vast network of bunkers and trenches that stretched across Europe, were meant to absorb enemy pressure. They relied on creating strong points and defended zones where they could repel attacks with superior weapons and well-trained soldiers. Yet despite this seemingly impenetrable array of defenses, the Americans kept finding ways through, ways to outmaneuver, outthink, and ultimately exploit the very fortifications the Germans believed would keep them safe. The speed of American attacks, coupled with their ability to think on their feet, gave them the upper hand. What the Germans thought would be an obstacle became an opportunity for the Allies. The irony of this situation was that while the Germans had every technological advantage, they could not adapt to the shifting nature of warfare. The Allies, on the other hand, had learned to move quickly and decisively. The Germans, with all their might, were constantly forced to react. It was not the brute force of the American offensive that was winning battles. It was the ability to exploit vulnerability, to find weaknesses in the most unlikely places, and strike before the enemy could regroup. The Germans' traditional reliance on static, prepared defenses was no match for the Americans' fluid, dynamic tactics. What was revealed in these clashes, time and again, was a fundamental truth. It wasn't the raw strength or superior weaponry that determined the outcome. It was the ability to exploit gaps. The U.S. military understood that each defensive line, each fortified position, held within it a vulnerability. The key was not to push forward where resistance was strongest, but to find where the Germans were weakest and attack there. Whether it was a poorly defended flank, a gap in intelligence, or the exhaustion of German forces, the Americans knew that speed and precision were the most effective weapons at their disposal. In this way, the battle was not won by massing troops or overwhelming an enemy's position with artillery. It was won by identifying the precise moment to strike. The result of this approach was clear. The ability to seize upon moments of weakness shifted the momentum of the war in favor of the Allies. While the Germans were still reeling from the effects of a war on multiple fronts, the Americans were systematically dismantling their defenses with an efficiency and precision the Germans could not match. The Allies had learned to play a different kind of game, a game that relied not on overwhelming force, but on knowing when and where to apply it. And while the Germans struggled to keep up with the increasingly unpredictable and fast-moving American strategy, their once-thought impenetrable defenses began to crumble, one gap at a time. For the Germans, the struggle was now one of constant desperation. As the Allies pushed deeper into their territory, the Germans found themselves scrambling to reorganize their defenses, only to have those new positions exposed by the very tactics they had once relied upon. With each new breach, the realization grew clearer. The Allies were not just stronger in numbers or technology, they had outsmarted them. And with each weakness that was uncovered, the Germans' hopes of a successful defense began to fade. The war was no longer about holding lines or holding territory. It was about survival in the face of a relentless, adaptable enemy. The Germans could no longer depend on the strategies that had once made them so formidable. The Allies had mastered a different form of warfare, one that was based on intelligence, speed, and a relentless ability to exploit gaps. The U.S. military had discovered the true secret to victory. But as the war drew closer to its end, one final question lingered. Could the Germans find a way to stop the inevitable, or had they already lost the war before they even knew it? By the fall of 1944, the war in Europe had entered a critical phase. The Allies, having successfully stormed Normandy and pushed through France, were now barreling through the heart of Germany's defenses. Yet even with every inch of land gained, the Germans, who had long prided themselves on their fortified positions, couldn't quite grasp what was happening. Despite the strength of their defenses, the relentless pressure of the U.S. forces and their ability to adapt quickly on the battlefield had led to decisive breakthroughs. What had once been perceived as a formidable defense line now seemed like a brittle barrier, crumbling under the weight of constant American innovation. As American forces began to break through the German defenses, the German high command found itself bewildered. Their strategic thinking, honed over the previous years of war, relied on predictability. They were accustomed to a battlefield where positions were solid, plans were inflexible, and strategies were executed with precision. But the Americans, in contrast, were masters of change. The Allies had learned that success in modern warfare was not about sticking rigidly to a plan. It was about being able to adapt in real time, to shift tactics rapidly in response to the fluid conditions of battle. Each moment of hesitation or overconfidence from the Germans was met with an American force that was one step ahead, already moving, already thinking in ways the Germans had never anticipated. The irony, of course, lay in the Germans' failure to understand what the Allies were doing. They still relied on outdated strategies, methods that had been effective in earlier stages of the war, but were now increasingly ineffective against the ever-evolving nature of the conflict. Where the Germans built their strength around rigidity and control, the Americans had become fluid and unpredictable, often striking before the Germans could even react. In battle after battle, the Germans kept finding themselves a step behind. What was once a predictable war of attrition had become an unpredictable contest of will, where the ability to think and act quickly determined the victor. What was revealed over the course of 1944 was the critical factor that had eluded the German command: adaptability. The key to the American success lay not in the sheer might of their numbers, nor in the overwhelming strength of their tanks and aircraft, but in their unparalleled ability to use unpredictable tactics to keep the Germans off balance. The U.S. military had mastered the art of psychological warfare, where deception and flexibility became as important as firepower. The Germans, clinging to their old methods, couldn't keep up with the changing rhythm of the war. The Allies had taken control, not just of the terrain, but of the battle's tempo. As the Americans advanced, the situation for the Germans grew increasingly dire. The Allies were no longer simply pushing through defenses. They were making calculated strikes, feints, and deceptive moves, all while maintaining constant pressure. The German military, already exhausted and strained on multiple fronts, had no way to counter this new type of warfare. The speed at which the U.S. forces could adapt to changing conditions was a constant challenge for the Germans. Every move they made was met with swift retaliation or exploitation of a vulnerability they could no longer afford to leave exposed. The result of this strategic shift was profound. By the end of 1944, the Germans were on the defensive, pushed back by an enemy they could no longer predict. Where once they had held firm against the onslaught of Allied forces, now they found themselves constantly retreating, unable to hold their ground. What had begun as a strategic advantage, fortified lines, well-drilled armies, and advanced technology, was crumbling under the weight of an adversary that had learned to think and act faster. The German command's failure to understand the shift in warfare, to acknowledge the growing power of adaptability, would prove to be a fatal mistake. It was the moment when the Allies could not fail. The Americans had achieved what many believed impossible, turning the tide of war not through sheer force of arms, but through tactical brilliance. The Allies had learned how to fight a different kind of war, one based on flexibility, surprise, and a relentless drive to exploit the weaknesses of their opponents. The German army, which had once seemed indomitable, was now on the retreat, unable to adjust to the pace of the new war. As the Allies pressed forward, the question that lingered in the air was whether the Germans could recognize their failure before it was too late. Would they adapt to this new reality, or had the momentum of the Allies already sealed their fate? The war was not over yet, but the Germans now knew they were on borrowed time. As winter descended upon Europe in late 1944, the fate of the German Reich seemed sealed, though its leaders would not yet admit it. The Allies, now fully attuned to the advantages of flexibility, pressed forward with relentless determination. Having spent the past year evolving their tactics, adapting to the changing nature of the battlefield, they were no longer simply a force of massed soldiers and superior numbers. Instead, they were a force of unpredictability, attacking not just with firepower but with a mind that could pivot with every shift in the wind. The Germans, meanwhile, were scrambling to regroup. They had been pushed back on multiple fronts, and their once-proud military machine was now showing signs of disarray. What had once been an unstoppable juggernaut was now struggling to keep pace with an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. The irony of this situation was profound. The German military, which had once been the most powerful force in Europe, was now completely disoriented. For all their advanced technology, their carefully constructed defenses, and their skilled troops, they found themselves repeatedly caught off guard by the unorthodox tactics of the Americans. What had once been a war fought on predictable terms was now a battlefield full of surprises, and the Germans were being forced to respond to moves they did not understand. The rigid military hierarchy and doctrines that had once served them so well now felt like shackles. Instead of dictating the terms of battle, the Germans were on the back foot, perpetually reacting to the fluidity of American tactics. The turning point came in the brutal cold of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans launched a counteroffensive in a desperate bid to stem the tide, hoping to split the Allied forces and retake key territory. Initially, it seemed as if they might succeed. Yet even in the face of this surprise attack, the Americans did not falter. Instead of crumbling under pressure, the U.S. forces adapted swiftly, exploiting the gaps in German strategy, using their mobility to outmaneuver the enemy. The Germans had hoped that overwhelming force would force the Americans into a retreat, but it was the Germans who found themselves in retreat instead. The breakthrough at the Bulge wasn't just a victory for the Allies. It was a testament to the effectiveness of adaptability over brute force. The German army had been outmaneuvered, not outgunned. This moment was the culmination of a longer process of revelation. The Germans, for all their technological might and experience, were finally defeated not by superior numbers or weaponry, but by the very thing they had overlooked, the ability to adapt quickly and decisively. The U.S. forces had long embraced this approach, and now it was clear that their greatest strength lay in their ability to shift tactics, exploit weaknesses, and maintain constant pressure. The Germans could no longer rely on their old strategies to stay ahead. Their attempts to regain the initiative only served to expose their own vulnerabilities. Every time they tried to regroup, they found that the Americans were already a step ahead, striking in unexpected places and keeping them perpetually off balance. As the winter dragged on, the Germans were forced into retreat, their once feared defenses crumbling under the weight of the Allied advance. The German high command, stunned by the speed and flexibility of American tactics, could not recover from the blows dealt to their military. They had been outpaced, outsmarted, and outmaneuvered by an enemy that refused to play by the old rules of warfare. It was not the raw power of the U.S. military that defeated the Germans. It was the ingenuity of their tactics, their ability to seize upon the smallest opportunities, and their relentless drive to adapt to the ever-changing conditions of war. The result of this relentless push was undeniable. The Germans, for all their past triumphs, were in retreat. Unable to recover from the tactical disadvantage the Americans had created, they found themselves cornered, their once pristine lines shattered. The final defeat was now only a matter of time. And as the Allies drew closer to the heart of the German Reich, the question lingered. Could the Germans do anything to reverse the course of history, or had the Allies already sealed their fate? The war was nearing its end, but the road to defeat for the Germans had already been paved by their failure to adapt. The lesson was clear. In war, as in life, the ability to change, to learn, and to move forward is often more powerful than the might of any army. The Allies had proved this to be true. But as the end of the war loomed closer, the final chapter was still unwritten. Would the Germans be able to face the inevitable, or would their inability to evolve mark their ultimate downfall? The winter of 1945 marked a moment of near inevitability for the Axis powers. The Allies had advanced steadily through the heart of Europe, pushing the Germans back with relentless precision. As the final assault on Germany loomed, the sheer scale of what had been achieved was undeniable. Victory was within reach, but the last push was never certain, and it would require more than firepower alone. The key to success was the same strategy that had brought the Allies this far: the ability to adapt, to move swiftly, and to outthink their opponent. The turning point of this final phase of the war had come long before the first tank rumbled into Germany's borders. It had come in the smaller, seemingly insignificant victories, the rapid maneuvers, the feints, the constant shifting of the battlefield that kept the German high command perpetually reacting. What had once seemed like chaos to the Germans had turned into the very engine of the Allied victory. The unpredictable tactics that the Germans had dismissed as disorderly had proven to be the linchpin of the Allied strategy. The U.S. forces, in particular, had mastered the art of keeping the enemy off balance. Their ability to strike unexpectedly, to shift direction at a moment's notice, and to keep the Germans guessing at every turn had led them all the way to the gates of Berlin. The irony, however, was not lost on the Germans. They had once believed that order and precision were the key to success. Their strategies, rooted in meticulously planned movements and fortified positions, had been designed to control the battlefield. But in the face of the Allies' tactics, those strategies were revealed to be increasingly ineffective. The Germans could no longer respond with the same efficiency. They were trapped in their own patterns, unable to break free from the rigidity of their plans. The Allies, by contrast, thrived in uncertainty, adapting on the fly to every new challenge. It was not brute force or sheer numbers that had won the Allies this war. It was their ability to use unpredictability to their advantage. As the Allies advanced into the heart of Germany, it became clear that the Germans had failed to adjust to the new reality of modern warfare. The relentless pace at which the Allies adapted to each shift in the battlefield left the Germans reeling. Tanks, artillery, and advanced technology had their place, but it was the speed of thought, the ability to rapidly assess a situation and pivot accordingly, that determined the outcome. The Germans could no longer react fast enough. Their once formidable forces, now stretched thin and disorganized, could not keep up with the constantly evolving tactics of the Allies. Where the Germans once had the initiative, they now found themselves chasing shadows, always a step behind. The final victory, the one that would seal the fate of Nazi Germany, was not merely the product of larger armies or stronger weapons. It was the result of a shift in the very nature of warfare. The Allies had learned to think faster, to adapt more swiftly, and to keep their adversary guessing. This new approach, one born from the lessons of earlier battles, had now become their ultimate weapon. It was a weapon the Germans could not comprehend, let alone counter. While German generals clung to their old strategies, the Allies moved forward with a new kind of warfare, one that was as fluid and unpredictable as the battlefields themselves. And so, as the final convoys of Allied forces began to close in on Germany, the result was inevitable. The German forces were outmatched, not by the number of tanks or artillery shells, but by the relentless agility of their opponents. The last-ditch efforts to hold the line fell apart as the Allies exploited every gap, every weakness. The war that had once seemed like an unstoppable force in favor of the Germans was now unmistakably in the hands of those who had mastered the art of adaptation. The Germans had failed to understand that the future of warfare was not about domination by firepower, but by adaptability, the ability to adjust quickly to changing circumstances, to surprise, to outmaneuver. The question remained: with their backs to the wall, was there any way for Germany to reverse its fate? Would a last-ditch effort to rally forces turn the tide, or had the Allies' relentless, unpredictable approach already sealed their victory? The final days of the Third Reich were now inevitable, but how soon would the world see its fall? When the Second World War came to its conclusion, the world looked at the Allies' victory with a sense of relief and triumph. The fall of Nazi Germany marked the end of a brutal chapter in human history. Yet, even as victory parades took place and soldiers returned home, the true nature of the Allied success remained largely overlooked. History would remember the victories, the heroic moments, and the leaders, but what often went uncelebrated was the core reason behind that triumph: the ability to adapt. The United States and its allies had succeeded not merely by force of arms, but by their ability to shift tactics, exploit opportunities, and innovate in real time. This flexibility, which had been crucial in turning the tide of battle, would shape the future of warfare in ways that were only fully appreciated in hindsight. The moral irony of this victory is striking. For all the accolades bestowed upon the Allied forces, their tanks, their soldiers, their air power, it was not sheer strength that won the war. Instead, the Germans, who had long been the undisputed masters of military strategy, fell because they could not adapt. Their reliance on rigid, predetermined plans, designed for a war that never came, led to their ultimate downfall. They had the strength, the technology, and the experience to win, but they were shackled by their inability to change. The Allies, on the other hand, understood that war was an unpredictable, dynamic environment. They recognized that the only constant on the battlefield was change. The Germans, too inflexible to embrace this reality, were left behind, unable to cope with the rapidly evolving nature of the conflict. What is often overlooked in recounting the war's greatest victories is that it was not just soldiers or generals who determined the outcome. It was the ability to innovate. The Allies' success was founded on their ability to see the battlefield as a fluid, ever-changing space where rigid tactics failed. Instead of fighting on the enemy's terms, the Allies created the conditions for their success by continuously adapting to the moment. Whether it was the ability to use deception to disorient the enemy, shifting forces rapidly to exploit weaknesses, or learning from past mistakes, the American and Allied forces created a new kind of warfare. The generals understood this, but it was the soldiers on the ground who proved it. Flexibility wasn't just a strategy. It was a mindset that permeated every level of command. The ability to adjust on the fly, to think under pressure, and to react faster than the enemy was what ultimately made the difference. By the war's end, the legacy of this adaptability began to take shape. The Allies, particularly the US, had reshaped military doctrine, and their methods would influence armies across the world in the decades to come. Military leaders began to embrace the idea that success in war would not come from sheer firepower or overwhelming numbers, but from the ability to adapt, to evolve, and to learn. The war had revealed that the real turning point had come not in the form of large-scale battles, but in the small shifts, the subtle changes in tactics that had given the Allies the upper hand. The Germans, for all their might, had failed to recognize that adaptability, speed, innovation, and the capacity to adjust to an ever-shifting battlefield was as crucial as any weapon. And so, as the Allies celebrated their victory, the true moral reflection began to emerge. The Germans had lost because they couldn't keep up with the speed of change. The war had changed beneath their feet, and they were unwilling or unable to adapt. On the other hand, the Allies had won because they could. They had learned from their failures, quickly adjusted their strategies, and met each challenge with the flexibility needed to turn the tide. The true triumph of the Allies was not their superior strength, but their ability to embrace the future of warfare, one where speed, adaptability, and constant innovation would be as important as any bomb, tank, or aircraft. In the end, the Allies' Edist legacy wasn't their technological superiority or the battlefield victories. They were merely the consequences of the real victory, the understanding that to win in war, you must first learn how to adapt. But what the world didn't know was that this new model for warfare would soon be tested again, in wars that had yet to be fought. What the Allies had created, through innovation and adaptability, would shape the very nature of conflict in the coming decades. Could other nations learn this lesson, or would history repeat itself? As the war drew to its inevitable close in 1945, the engines of combat slowly fell silent. The world, relieved and scarred, looked towards a new future, one that was still being shaped by the devastation of the past. The Allies had emerged victorious, but the true nature of their success was often overshadowed by the more tangible, visible elements of the conflict: tanks roaring across fields, bombers soaring overhead, and artillery pounding the earth. History would praise these symbols of strength, yet the real key to Allied triumph was far more subtle. It lay not in the firepower they unleashed, but in their ability to adapt, to think on their feet, and to exploit weaknesses in the enemy's defenses. The moral irony of this reality was striking. Tanks, bombers, and artillery were the tangible markers of war, easy to measure, easy to see, and easy to memorialize. But the tactical flexibility that allowed the Allies to exploit the German vulnerabilities, to shift in response to changing conditions, was an innovation that remained largely underappreciated in the aftermath of the war. The Allies' success in Europe, at its core, had been built not on the strength of their weapons, but on their ability to continuously innovate and adapt to the battlefield in ways that were often invisible to the public eye. And yet, as history would soon prove, it was this very adaptability, the ability to change tactics, to think on the move, and to outsmart the enemy, that had been the deciding factor in the war. It was the real turning point, the strategic innovation that would influence military doctrine for generations to come. The revelation, however, was lost on many. The generals who took credit for victory often failed to acknowledge the true engine behind their success: the soldiers, officers, and commanders who adapted in real time. These men and women were not simply following orders. They were reacting to a dynamic, unpredictable battlefield, using their initiative and ingenuity to respond to threats as they emerged. In the thick of combat, they relied on more than just training. They relied on their ability to make split-second decisions, to exploit an opportunity when it arose, and to push forward even when the situation seemed to change by the minute. It was their ability to think and act quickly, in contrast to the rigid, outdated strategies of the Germans, that turned the tide. And yet, despite this, it was often the generals, safely far from the front lines, who received the accolades, while the true innovators, the soldiers and officers on the ground, remained largely unsung. In the aftermath of the war, history would cast the war as a clash of ideologies, a struggle of firepower, and a battle for world supremacy. The Allies had defeated the Axis not just through superior strength, but through the force of their convictions, their unity, and the scale of their mobilization. The story, as it would be told, would be one of tanks and bombers, of vast armies marching across Europe, of explosive moments that defined the conflict. But the true turning point of the war, the one that would reshape military history for years to come, was not a single battle or moment of firepower. It was the shift in tactics, the realization that adaptability was just as important as strength. The Allies had learned that the key to victory in modern warfare lay not just in overwhelming the enemy with weapons, but in staying one step ahead through constant innovation and adaptation. And so, as the engines of war finally went silent and the world began to rebuild, the U.S. military's ability to adapt and innovate in the heat of battle became the foundation for a new kind of warfare. The lessons learned in those critical years would reverberate far beyond the end of World War II. For the soldiers who had fought, for the generals who had led them, and for the future of warfare itself, the victory was not just in the weapons used or the land taken, but in the ability to think, to evolve, and to outthink the enemy. History, though it remembers the tanks, the bombers, and the battles, will one day understand this fundamental truth. The real weapon that won the war was not a bomb or a gun. It was the mind, the ability to adapt, to innovate, and to act decisively in the face of an ever-changing battlefield. The question remains, would future conflicts ever see a shift so profound in how war was waged? Could the lessons of adaptability be applied again in ways yet unseen? Only time would tell. The war had raged for years, a brutal contest of wills, strength, and ideology. For much of it, the Germans believed that victory would come through the overwhelming force of their military machine. Tanks, artillery, bombers, they had it all. And for a time, these weapons of destruction seemed to guarantee their dominance. But as the war drew to its end, it became clear that the true turning point had not been a weapon at all. It wasn't a new tank or bomb. It was something far more elusive, something the Germans had failed to grasp: adaptability. The Allies had learned that in war, the greatest advantage wasn't in firepower alone, but in the ability to change, to evolve, and to outthink the enemy. While the Germans clung to their traditional methods, the Allies adapted with surprising speed. And this simple shift in mindset changed the course of history. The Germans, for all their superior weapons, could not adjust to the evolving nature of warfare. They had built their strategies around what they knew: fortified positions, methodical offensives, and brute force. But as the Allies' tactics grew more unpredictable, the Germans found themselves at a disadvantage. The success of the American forces, in particular, lay in their ability to think on their feet, to strike at weaknesses, and to adapt when conditions changed. The Germans, meanwhile, stuck rigidly to old methods that no longer worked. Their over-reliance on firepower, their belief that superior tanks and artillery would guarantee victory, led to a critical miscalculation. They underestimated the power of flexibility, and it was that fatal mistake that led to their undoing. What the Germans failed to see, and what the Allies soon realized, was that the true turning point in the war wasn't about who had the biggest guns or the fastest tanks. It was about the willingness to fight a different kind of war. The Allies understood that every battlefield was unpredictable. They knew that war was not static. It was fluid, and in that fluidity lay opportunities to strike decisively. Their ability to exploit these moments of weakness, to disrupt the German defenses with speed and unpredictability, became their greatest strength. This was a war not just of firepower, but of ideas, and the Americans had discovered the most potent weapon of all, the ability to adapt. The war's final lesson, then, was not that brute strength wins battles. It was that the ability to outthink the enemy and to adapt to the ever-changing battlefield was the key to victory. The Germans were defeated not because they lacked strength, but because they could not change their methods in the face of a rapidly evolving war. On the other hand, the Allies succeeded because they had embraced a new kind of warfare, one that prized flexibility, surprise, and adaptation over sheer force. The tactics that the Germans had dismissed as unrefined, as disorderly, turned out to be the very tactics that led to their downfall. The Americans, in contrast, understood the power of unpredictability. They had rewritten the rules of engagement, realizing that victory didn't lie in forcing the enemy to follow their script, but in making the enemy react to theirs. What had seemed chaotic to the Germans was, in fact, a brilliant and effective strategy that led them to victory. The world would remember the Allied success as a triumph of military might, but the true secret to their victory was in their ability to adapt, to learn, and to embrace an ever-changing battlefield. It was this adaptability that ensured they would rewrite the history of warfare. In the end, the Germans built their strategies to win battles, but they ultimately ended up losing the war. The tactics they dismissed as unreliable or unprofessional became the very ones that led to their destruction. The Allies didn't just win the war with tanks, bombers, and artillery. They won it by rewriting the rules of warfare itself, by making flexibility their strongest weapon. And in doing so, they set the course for future conflicts, where adaptability would become the foundation of military strategy.